Have you ever sat in a room full of strangers, knowing that a single word from your mouth could completely shatter the biggest day of your ex-husband's life? My name is Caroline, and the moment the bride saw me across the crowded ballroom, every bit of color drained instantly from her beautiful face. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable night, take a quick moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves a story about true justice. It helps ensure you never miss any of our upcoming dramatic journeys together. She was standing proudly beside my ex-husband, holding a delicate crystal champagne flute and smiling radiantly for the photographers under a massive wall of elegant white roses. Then, her eyes locked directly onto mine. The radiant smile vanished in an instant. "Wait," she whispered to herself. The glass nearly slipped from her shaking hand. "Miss Morgan." I almost spat out my champagne because the rich woman my ex-husband was marrying actually worked directly for me. For a few tense seconds, nobody else in the grand room seemed to notice anything was wrong. The jazz band continued playing their smooth melodies. Servers moved gracefully through the crowded ballroom, carrying heavy silver trays of shrimp cocktail. Guests laughed loudly at large tables covered with pristine ivory linens and shining gold centerpieces. But I noticed, and Vanessa noticed, and deep down, I think Richard noticed something was wrong too, because he suddenly stopped smiling. I sat quietly in my seat and set my champagne glass down before I embarrassed myself. 20 years. It had been exactly 20 long years since our painful divorce. 20 years after Richard walked out of our family home and our marriage, completely convinced he was leaving an ordinary, uninteresting woman behind. And now, here we were, at his lavish wedding, the wedding he had specifically invited me to attend. The wedding he wanted me to witness, with my own eyes. The wedding where he fully intended to prove something to me. The wedding where everything had just gone terribly, terribly wrong. I should probably explain exactly how I ended up sitting in a high-end country club ballroom in Charleston, South Carolina, watching my ex-husband marry one of my own company's top executives. Because if someone had told me 20 years ago that this exact scene would happen, I would have laughed myself absolutely silly. Back then, I was a 50-something wife who had spent almost the entirety of her adult life supporting absolutely everyone except herself. Richard and I had been married for 35 long years. We raised 2 wonderful children, built a beautiful home, attended church together every single Sunday, hosted massive Thanksgiving dinners, paid off a heavy mortgage, and lived what most ordinary people would call a respectable, quiet American life. Or, at least, I genuinely thought we did. The surprise came when Richard suddenly informed me out of nowhere that he simply wasn't happy. It did not happen during marriage counseling. It did not happen after years of deep discussion. It did not happen gradually over time. One ordinary evening, he simply sat across from me at the kitchen table and said he wanted a divorce. Just like that, with no real warning. I still remember the loud clock ticking on the wall behind him. I remember the rich smell of the fresh coffee I had just brewed. I remember thinking he must be playing some kind of cruel joke, but he wasn't. "I want more out of life," he told me coldly. I asked him what that statement actually meant. He couldn't really explain it to me, at least not honestly. Over time, the ugly truth emerged. Richard was completely tired of feeling ordinary. He wanted excitement, public recognition, and high social status. He wanted people to look at him and feel envy, and somehow in his own mind he had convinced himself that I was the one standing in his way. The divorce was incredibly painful, not because of the arguments over money, but because of the deep disappointment. When you have spent decades building a life with someone, you expect problems, you expect hardships along the way, you expect ordinary arguments. You just don't expect to discover that your partner secretly views you as part of the furniture, something familiar, something completely replaceable. After the final divorce papers were signed, Richard moved far away. He bounced between random business ventures, new relationships, risky investments, and different cities. Every single Christmas card and family update he sent seemed explicitly designed to showcase his immense success. New luxury cars, new expensive houses, new exotic vacations, new girlfriends, then, eventually, much younger girlfriends. Our adult children remained completely polite to him, but even they grew incredibly tired of the constant performance. As for me, I stayed busy. Not because I had grand, sweeping ambitions, but simply because I needed to survive on my own. At first, I worked as a simple consultant, helping regional healthcare clinics improve their messy daily operations. It wasn't glamorous work at all. It involved long drives on empty highways, tiny cramped offices, stressful budget meetings, and paperwork. Lots and lots of exhausting paperwork. But I found that I truly enjoyed solving difficult problems, and apparently, I was incredibly good at it. One small clinic eventually became 3, 3 became 10, 10 became dozens. As the years passed, my little consulting practice grew into a real company. The The company grew, then it grew again. Before I even realized what was happening, we had established offices across several states, employed hundreds of dedicated workers, created massive partnerships with major hospitals, and earned an incredibly respected reputation. The funny thing was, I never really changed much myself. I still drove practical, reliable cars, still lived comfortably rather than extravagantly, still attended my local church, still volunteered my free time, and still preferred simple family cookouts over fancy corporate galas. People often assume that successful individuals must look successful in a flashy way. Many simply don't. I certainly didn't, which may completely explain why Richard never realized what had actually happened to my life. Not that he ever bothered to ask me. 3 months before the wedding, the invitation arrived in the mail. It was heavy cardstock with elegant gold lettering, the exact kind of invitation explicitly designed to announce someone's self-importance. I opened it while standing in my quiet kitchen. My little granddaughter was coloring happily at the table. The envelope contained the formal invitation to Richard's wedding along with a short handwritten note. I remember every single word written on that page. Caroline, I hope you have finally found some happiness. It would mean a lot to me if you could attend. Richard. I laughed out loud right there in my kitchen, not because it was funny, but because it was completely transparent. After 20 years of silence, Richard suddenly wanted my presence at his wedding. No, Richard didn't want my presence. He wanted an audience. Specifically, he wanted me in that audience. The message was obvious. Look what I found. Look how successful I became without you. Look what I managed to upgrade to. My daughter completely agreed with me. When I showed her the golden invitation, she rolled her eyes. Dad just wants attention, she said. He probably does, I replied. Are you actually going? She asked. I thought about it for a few minutes. Then, I surprised myself. Yes, I am going. She blinked in disbelief. Seriously? Why? The truth was simple. I wasn't angry anymore. Age changes things completely. At 62 years old, I no longer had the energy or the desire to carry around old, heavy resentments. I had beautiful grandchildren, wonderful friends, work I truly enjoyed, and a life I was deeply grateful for. Richard no longer occupied enough space in my heart to ruin a perfectly good weekend. So, I RSVP'd yes. The exclusive country club sat beautifully along the scenic Ashley River. It was a stunning property with beautiful weather and gorgeous decorations. Everything looked absolutely perfect. When I arrived at the venue, nobody recognized me, which suited me just fine. I took my seat quietly near the back, accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a server, and watched the wealthy guests mingle. Then Richard appeared. He was older, of course, a little heavier around the middle, a little grayer at the temples, but still carrying himself with that familiar, arrogant confidence. He moved through the crowded room, greeting people warmly, laughing loudly, telling tall stories, and playing the perfect host. And then he appeared proudly beside his bride, Vanessa. Vanessa was 38 years old, smart, incredibly talented, and one of the absolute strongest executives working in my company. She was a woman I had personally mentored for nearly a decade, a woman I genuinely liked, and a woman who apparently had absolutely no idea she was about to marry my ex-husband. The moment she looked across the room and saw me, everything changed. Her smile disappeared completely. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, and under her breath, barely audible across the ballroom, she said, "Ms. Morgan." Vanessa stared at me as if she had just seen a ghost. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't smile, and didn't even blink. The music continued to play around us, and the guests kept talking, completely unaware that the evening had just taken a very unexpected turn. Then, Vanessa handed her champagne glass to a passing server. "Excuse me," she murmured to Richard. Without taking her eyes off me for a single second, she stepped away from him and began walking directly across the ballroom toward my table. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, why not take a brief moment to show your support? Smashing the like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this video with your family helps us tell more stories of resilience and truth. It means the world to us. I sat perfectly still in my chair. A part of me was incredibly curious to see what would happen next. When she finally reached my table, she stopped and looked down at me. "Ms. Morgan." Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with confusion. I smiled warmly up at her. "Hello, Vanessa." She looked genuinely stunned to see me. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't help laughing softly at the irony. "I was invited." The confusion on her face deepened instantly. "Invited?" I nodded my head. "By the groom." Vanessa slowly turned her head toward Richard, then back toward me, then back toward Richard again. And suddenly, I could almost see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place inside her brilliant mind. Oh my God! I took a calm sip of my champagne. That was pretty much my exact reaction, too. She slowly lowered herself into the empty chair right beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke a word. Then, she leaned much closer to me. "Please tell me I'm misunderstanding something here," she whispered. I smiled gently at her. "I truly wish you were, Vanessa." Her face went entirely pale. "Richard Morgan?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Your ex-husband?" she asked. "Unfortunately, yes." Vanessa closed her eyes tightly. Oh no, I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. Not because she had done anything wrong to me, but because she looked genuinely blindsided by the truth, and because I knew exactly what it felt like when life suddenly reveals information you were not prepared to hear. She rubbed her forehead with her hand. "You never told me," she said. "I didn't know." She stared at me. "You didn't know?" "I had absolutely no idea who you were marrying, Vanessa." She let out a long, heavy breath. "Neither did I," she whispered. That answer genuinely surprised me. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. Vanessa glanced nervously toward the crowded dance floor, where Richard was busy entertaining a group of guests. "He talks about his past very little," she explained. I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She nodded. "He always described his divorce as ancient history." I almost laughed out loud. Ancient history. 35 years of marriage, 2 children, and a whole lifetime reduced to just 2 words. That sounded exactly like Richard. Vanessa folded her hands tightly together in her lap. "I knew he had been married before," she said, "and that's about it." I studied her face carefully. She looked deeply embarrassed, not guilty, and not defensive. Embarrassed. That distinction mattered immensely to me. One of the great advantages of growing older is learning how to read people accurately, and at 62, I had become fairly good at it. Vanessa wasn't hiding anything from me. She was simply trying to understand the massive reality that had just dropped into her lap. "So," she asked cautiously, "how long were you two married?" 35 years, I said. Her jaw dropped open. 35 years, give or take, I replied. "That's longer than I've been alive," she whispered. That made me laugh a little. "Now you're making me feel old, Vanessa." A small smile appeared on her face, then disappeared just as quickly. "Caroline," she said quietly. She rarely called me Caroline. At work, it was always strictly Ms. Morgan. The fact that she had switched to my first name told me exactly how shaken she was. "Did Richard know you owned the company?" I nearly choked on my champagne. "No, he has no idea." "Seriously?" she asked. "Seriously," I said. She stared at me in disbelief. "But you're the founder." "Yes, I am." "The CEO?" "Also yes, the person who signs my paychecks every single month." I nodded. Vanessa slowly leaned back in her chair, absorbing it. Wow. There was no arrogance in her reaction, only absolute amazement. For years, I had worked incredibly hard to keep my personal life entirely separate from my business. Most employees knew I started the company, but very few knew much beyond that. I preferred it that way. Titles don't impress me. Character does. Unfortunately, Richard had always believed the exact opposite. Across the ballroom, I noticed Richard watching us closely. His smile was still plastered on his face, but something looked completely different about it now. It was forced, tight, like a man trying desperately to convince himself that everything remained under his complete control. Vanessa noticed it too. "He sees us talking," she said. "Yes, he does. He's wondering what's happening over here. Probably." She sighed deeply. Oh, this is bad. I couldn't disagree with her, though not for the exact reasons she imagined. The real problem wasn't that Richard's fiancée worked for me. The real problem was that Richard had invited me here fully believing I was still the exact same woman he had left 20 years earlier. The lonely woman, the struggling woman, the woman who would sit quietly in the back and admire everything he had managed to build. Instead, he had unknowingly invited someone who represented a truth he wasn't prepared to face. That life had continued quite successfully after him. An hour later, dinner was served. The ballroom overlooked the beautiful river, and the fading sunlight reflected beautifully off the water outside. Guests chatted happily over crab cakes and grilled filet. The atmosphere remained elegant, but beneath the surface, a strange tension had started to spread. Not because anyone knew the full story, but because people sensed something unusual was happening. Vanessa was deeply distracted. Richard seemed increasingly nervous, and I suspect several guests had started to notice. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa excused herself from the head table again. This time, she returned carrying a small leather folder. I recognized it immediately. She never traveled anywhere without it. Inside were her personal notes, schedules, and important business documents. She placed it quietly beside her chair. Then, she looked at me. "I need to ask you something, Caroline." "Go ahead," I said. "Did Richard really not know anything about your success?" "No, not even once." I shook my head. Vanessa looked stunned. Over the years, she had heard stories about my company, the early struggles, the massive growth, the acquisitions, and our charitable foundation that funded healthcare programs throughout South Carolina and Georgia. She couldn't understand how someone married to me for 35 years could know absolutely none of it. The answer was simple. Richard stopped paying attention to me long before he finally left. As the evening progressed, old memories kept returning to me. Not painful memories, but interesting ones. The divorce had forced me to rebuild my confidence from scratch. Back then, I didn't know whether I could survive on my own. I worried about the bills, about loneliness, about getting older, and about becoming completely invisible to the world. Many women of my generation understand that fear, especially after long marriages. You spend decades defining yourself as someone's wife. Then, suddenly, you are completely alone. The silence in an empty house can feel overwhelming. But over time, something remarkable happened to me. I learned exactly who I was without Richard, and the answer turned out to be much stronger than I ever expected. The company grew because I grew as a person, not because I was extraordinary, but because I stopped asking for permission to believe in myself. That single realization changed everything for me. The wedding photographer began organizing the guests for group pictures. Richard finally approached our table. His smile looked polished, practiced, and entirely artificial. "Everything okay over here?" he asked. Vanessa looked at him, then looked at me. Neither of us answered him immediately. For the first time all evening, Richard appeared genuinely uncomfortable. I could almost see his mind calculating, trying to understand what had happened, trying to determine how much Vanessa knew, and trying to determine how much I might say to her. I smiled politely at him. "Congratulations, Richard." His eyes narrowed slightly, and for the briefest moment, I saw fear in them. Not anger, not embarrassment, but pure fear. Because deep down, he had finally realized something. The woman he thought he had invited to humiliate wasn't the woman he remembered anymore, and he wasn't entirely sure what was going to come next. If you are loving this story of truth and transformation, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. Your support is what keeps us going, bringing you unique and engaging stories every week. Richard stood beside our table with the tight smile of a man trying desperately to look relaxed. Unfortunately for him, I had spent 35 years married to him. I knew every single version of that smile. The genuine one, the charming one, the sales pitch smile, and the nervous smile. This was definitely the nervous smile. "Everything okay over here?" he asked again. Vanessa looked at him, then looked at me. The silence stretched out just a little too long. Finally, she answered, "Fine." Richard visibly relaxed, far too quickly, which told me he was already deeply worried. He pulled out an empty chair. "Mind if I join you two?" Neither of us objected, so he sat down. For several moments, nobody spoke a single word. The three of us simply watched the guests moving around the ballroom. A string quartet had replaced the jazz band. Sunlight reflected beautifully off the Ashley River outside the large windows. It should have been a perfect evening for him. Instead, it felt like three people were sitting directly on top of a fault line, waiting for the earthquake to hit. Richard finally broke the heavy silence. "So, Caroline?" I looked at him. "Yes, Richard. I'm surprised you actually came," he said. There it was. The very first honest thing he had said all evening. I smiled at him. "You invited me after all." He laughed nervously. "You could have easily declined." "I could have," I agreed. His eyes studied my face intensely, searching for something. Bitterness, perhaps, resentment, or pain. But 20 years is a very long time. I wasn't carrying those heavy things anymore, and I think that completely unsettled him. People who want to hurt you usually expect to see evidence of the wound they inflicted. When they can't find it, they become deeply confused. Vanessa quietly folded her hands on the table. "I have a question for you, Richard." Richard smiled at his bride. "Sure, honey, go ahead. Did you know Caroline owns Morgan Healthcare Consulting?" The color drained completely from his face in an instant. It happened so quickly that it was almost funny to watch. "What?" he stammered. Vanessa repeated the question slowly and carefully, as if she were speaking to a small child. "Did you know that Caroline owns Morgan Healthcare Consulting?" Richard stared blankly, then looked at me, then back at Vanessa, then back at me again. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to laugh it off. Vanessa blinked at him. You're serious? Richard turned his gaze toward me. Caroline? I simply shrugged my shoulders. What would you like me to say, Richard? For several seconds, he simply stared at me, then he laughed nervously. Not because anything was funny, but because he thought the entire situation was absolutely impossible. No, he said. Yes, Vanessa countered. No, he repeated. Yes, she said firmly. Vanessa looked back and forth between us. Richard, she's literally the founder of the company. He shook his head in denial. That can't be right. I leaned back comfortably in my chair. Why can't it be right, Richard? His mouth opened, then closed, because he couldn't answer that question honestly in front of his new bride. The truthful answer would have sounded absolutely terrible. The truthful answer was, because I never believed you could ever become something important without me. The conversation died very quickly after that. Richard excused himself nervously and disappeared into the large crowd of guests. Vanessa watched him leave, then looked over at me. Wow, she said. That pretty much sums it up perfectly, I replied. She sighed. I really don't think he knew anything about it. He didn't, I confirmed. How is that even possible? She asked. I smiled sadly at her, because some people stop truly seeing you long before they actually leave you. Vanessa didn't respond to that, but I could tell she understood exactly what I meant. Over the next hour, the evening became increasingly interesting, not because I said anything more, but because other people. The first was an older gentleman named Frank Delaney. Frank served on the board of one of our major nonprofit healthcare initiatives. He spotted me from across the crowded Badiddle room and immediately walked over to our table. Caroline? His booming voice turned several heads in our direction. I stood up and gave him a warm hug. Frank, what are you doing here? I asked. My niece is close friends with the bride. He laughed. Small world, isn't it? Then he turned toward a group of nearby guests who were watching us. Do you folks actually know who this woman is? He asked loudly. I silently prayed he would stop talking right there. Frank never stopped talking. This woman practically changed healthcare access across 3 different states, he announced proudly. I closed my eyes in embarrassment. Frank continued anyway. She's far too modest to ever tell you herself, of course. Several guests looked deeply impressed. Others looked highly curious. One woman asked, Really? Frank nodded his head enthusiastically. Absolutely, she did. Then, he launched into a 5-minute speech about my accomplishments that I would have gladly paid him a fortune to avoid. Every single sentence he spoke made me increasingly uncomfortable, and every single sentence made Richard, who was watching from a distance, look increasingly pale. Soon, another guest approached our table, then another, then another. Some recognized my name from local business circles. Others knew our charitable foundation well. A few had worked directly with hospitals that partnered with us. I remained polite, grateful, and deeply embarrassed. I have never enjoyed public attention, but the damage to Richard's plan was already completely done. The narrative Richard had carefully imagined for tonight was beginning to collapse. People weren't looking at me as the sad ex-wife anymore. They were looking at me as Caroline, the successful CEO, and for some reason, that seemed to deeply bother him. If this story of unexpected twists is touching your heart, please take a quick moment to click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Your small action helps us bring more inspiring stories of truth and resilience to light. Near sunset, Vanessa found me standing completely alone on an outdoor terrace, overlooking the peaceful river. The evening air felt wonderful. It was cool, peaceful, and quiet compared to the loud ballroom inside. She stepped up beside me. Mind if I join you out here? She asked. Of course not, Vanessa, I said. For a while, we simply watched the boats moving slowly through the calm water. Finally, she spoke up. Can I ask you something deeply personal, Caroline? Sure, go ahead. Were you actually happy with him during your marriage? I thought about that question carefully, really thought about it, because after enough years pass, simple questions deserve honest answers. For a long time, yes, I was happy, I said. And afterward? She asked. I smiled gently at her. For a while, no, I wasn't. She nodded her head, then waited for me to continue. I continued, but eventually I realized something very important. Vanessa. What was that? She asked. The divorce didn't destroy my life at all. What did it do then? It forced me to build a real one. Vanessa looked out at the water, completely quiet and thoughtful. I could see the questions forming behind her eyes. Not just questions about me, but questions about herself, about Richard, about their relationship, and about their future together. When we finally returned inside the building, the reception had shifted into the formal speeches. The best man delivered a funny toast. Friends shared old stories. Guests laughed loudly. Everything appeared completely normal on the surface, but appearances can be highly deceptive, especially when important truths have just entered the room. Then came a shocking moment that absolutely nobody expected. Vanessa stood up, picked up a wireless microphone, and looked directly at Richard. The entire room fell completely silent. She smiled politely, then asked a single question, a question so simple that it should have been incredibly easy for him to answer, yet the terrified expression on Richard's face told me immediately that it wasn't. "Richard," she said softly into the microphone, "why did you really invite Caroline to our wedding tonight?" The entire ballroom went absolutely quiet, and for the very first time all evening, my ex-husband had nowhere left to hide. The ballroom became so quiet that I could actually hear the soft, distant hum of the air conditioning system. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, holding the microphone firmly. Richard sat frozen like a statue beside her. 100 pairs of eyes moved rapidly between the two of them, waiting, expecting, and wondering whether this was some kind of joke. It wasn't a joke. I knew it. Vanessa knew it, and judging by the look of pure panic on Richard's face, he knew it too. "Why did you really invite Caroline tonight?" She asked the question again. She didn't ask it angrily or dramatically, just calmly, the exact way people ask questions when they are genuinely ready to hear nothing but the truth. Unfortunately, the truth had never been Richard's favorite subject in life. He forced a loud, awkward laugh. "Oh, come on, Vanessa," he said. Nobody laughed along with him. His fake smile faltered. "I invited her because we are mature adults," he said. Total silence followed. Vanessa simply waited. "So, that's the whole reason?" she asked. "Of course it is," he insisted. The look she gave him reminded me exactly of a teacher catching a student cheating on a final test, patient, disappointed, and not convinced at all. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just thought it would be nice," he added. Still, absolute silence filled the room. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, because every single person in that room understood something. You don't invite an ex-wife you haven't spoken to in years to your wedding just because it would be nice, especially not when that marriage lasted for 35 years. People over 60 know better than that. We have lived too much life. We have seen too many complicated relationships to fall for that. Nobody believed him, not even himself. Vanessa finally lowered the microphone away from her mouth. "I think that's enough," she said quietly. The room relaxed slightly. Conversation slowly resumed among the tables. The immediate crisis appeared to have passed. But appearances can be deceptive because the real, life-altering conversation happened 30 minutes later in private. I was standing near the dessert table, looking at the cakes, when Richard approached me. His expression looked completely exhausted, much older than it had looked earlier in the evening. For the first time all night, he didn't seem like a confident, proud groom. He looked like a man who had completely run out of places to hide from reality. "Can we talk for a minute, Caroline?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. "Sure, Richard." We stepped outside onto a quiet, empty balcony overlooking the dark river. The lively reception continued right behind us. Music, laughter, clinking glasses, and life moving forward. For a while, neither of us spoke a word. Then, Richard sighed deeply. "I didn't know, Caroline." I smiled slightly. "I gathered that, Richard." "No, really, I mean it," he said. "I know you do." He rubbed his forehead with his hand. "Caroline," his voice sounded entirely different now, less polished, less controlled, and almost completely vulnerable. "I had absolutely no idea." I looked across the dark water. The sunset was fully gone now. An orange light was reflecting beautifully across the river from the city, the kind of view that reminds you how quickly life passes by. "What exactly didn't you know, Richard?" I asked him. He hesitated for a long moment. "Any of it," he confessed. I waited for him to continue. "The company," he said. "The foundation, the hospitals, the awards, the charity work." He shook his head in disbelief. I didn't know any of it. There was genuine disbelief in his voice, as though he still couldn't process the reality, as though the version of me sitting beside him tonight didn't fit the sad story he had been telling himself for 20 years. Then, he asked the question that I think had been deeply bothering him all evening. "When did all of this actually happen, Caroline?" I laughed softly into the night air. "Over the course of 20 years, Richard." His eyes narrowed. "No, seriously, tell me. I am being completely serious," I said. He just stared at me. I realized something important in that exact moment. Richard genuinely thought success happened suddenly, like winning a lottery or flipping a switch. He couldn't imagine 20 years of ordinary, daily effort, 20 years of early mornings, late nights, small decisions, quiet persistence, and the boring reality that lies behind all meaningful accomplishments. "Nobody becomes successful overnight, Richard," I said quietly. I certainly didn't. He looked away from me, staring down at the ground. For several minutes, we stood quietly in the dark. Then, he asked another question, one that genuinely surprised me. Were you angry at me? I turned my body toward him. After the divorce, you mean? He nodded his head. I considered the answer carefully, because after enough years pass, honesty matters far more than pride. Yes, I was, I admitted. He looked down at his shoes. I figured you were, he said. I was angry, I was deeply hurt, I was embarrassed, and I was absolutely scared, I told him. Then I smiled gently at him. But I wasn't angry forever, Richard. He looked up at me. How did you stop being angry? He asked. That question felt entirely sincere, not defensive or argumentative. Sincere, and strangely enough, I knew exactly how to answer him. Because eventually, Richard, I just got tired. Tired? He asked. Tired of carrying you around with me, I explained. His forehead wrinkled in confusion. What does that actually mean? It means that resentment is incredibly heavy, Richard. I looked out at the peaceful river. You can carry it with you for years, decades even, but eventually, you realize the only person who is actually feeling the crushing weight of that anger is you. Richard didn't say a single word back to me. If this powerful realization resonates with you, please take a quick moment to show your appreciation by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this video. We love sharing stories that remind us all of the power of letting go and finding peace. Back inside the venue, the reception continued, but something fundamental had changed. Not just for Richard, but for Vanessa too. I could see it clearly in her eyes when I looked through the glass. She wasn't focused on the wedding celebration anymore. She was evaluating everything, observing, thinking deeply, and trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same man. The man she thought she knew so well, and the flawed man she was meeting for the first time tonight. That realization actually made me feel a bit sad. Not because I wanted her relationship to fail, quite the opposite. I genuinely liked Vanessa. I respected her talent. She deserved absolute honesty. Everyone does. An hour later, she found me again. This time, it was near the quiet coffee station. Her expression was completely calm, far too calm, the specific kind of calm people develop only after they have made a massive, life-altering decision. Can we talk privately again, Caroline? Of course we can, I said. We sat down at a small table near the very back of the ballroom. For several seconds, she simply stared down into her black coffee. Then, she looked up into my eyes. Richard told me something, she said. I waited quietly. He admitted to me that he invited you here because he wanted you to see the wedding, she explained. I nodded my head. No surprise there, I said. Vanessa continued. He said a part of him desperately wanted you to know that he had successfully moved on to a better life. Again, no surprise to me, I replied. But, then she added something else. He also admitted he wanted other people to see you there at the table. That caught my attention. Meaning what exactly? I asked. She sighed heavily. He wanted witnesses to his victory over you. I almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I had suspected from the very beginning. Richard hadn't invited me for closure, or healing, or old friendship. He invited me because he wanted validation, proof, and clear evidence that he had somehow won something. The true tragedy was that life isn't a competition at all, especially at our age. By the time you reach 60, most of us have learned that victories aren't measured by bigger houses or younger spouses. They are measured by deep relationships, strong character, inner peace, the ability to sleep soundly at night, and the ability to look in a mirror without a shred of regret. Unfortunately, some lessons take people a lifetime to learn. Vanessa took a deep, steady breath. Then, she said something that absolutely shocked me. I don't think I can marry him tonight, Caroline. I stared at her in surprise. She wasn't crying, she wasn't angry, and she wasn't overly emotional. She sounded thoughtful and completely resolved, like someone finally listening to her true instincts. What are you going to do now? I asked her. She looked toward the dance floor where Richard stood completely alone, watching the two of us, waiting, hoping, and looking incredibly fearful. I think, she said quietly, I'm going to walk over there and ask him whether he truly wants a marriage. She paused for a second, or if he just wants an audience. And suddenly, I realized the wedding wasn't unraveling because of me or anything I had said. It was unraveling because the truth had finally arrived in that room. I spent most of my life believing that truth always arrives like a massive thunderstorm, loud, sudden, and completely impossible to ignore. But standing inside that ballroom, watching Vanessa quietly wrestle with the reality right in front of her, I realized truth usually arrives much differently. It arrives one uncomfortable question at a time, one inconsistency, one realization, one quiet conversation, until eventually the false story someone has been telling falls completely apart under its own heavy weight. And that's exactly what was happening to Richard tonight. Not because anyone was actively attacking him, because nobody was. The truth was doing all of the heavy lifting by itself. Vanessa stood up from our table. She smoothed down her white dress, took a deep breath, then walked directly toward Richard. I stayed right where I was. This wasn't my battle to fight. It never had been. Several guests sensed something major was happening. Conversations began fading away. Eyes followed Vanessa across the room. Richard immediately noticed her approaching him. The hopeful smile on his face lasted for only a few seconds. Then he saw the serious expression on her face, and his smile disappeared completely. "Can we talk privately in the back room?" she asked him. He nodded his head slowly. A few moments later, they disappeared together into a side conference room near the ballroom entrance. The heavy wooden door closed behind them. The main room instantly buzzed with quiet speculation. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone understood something highly significant was taking place. I remained seated at my table, sipping my warm coffee and watching the boats move along the dark river through the large windows. Oddly enough, I felt completely calm. 20 years ago, I would have been incredibly anxious, curious, or maybe even vindictive. Now, I simply felt tired. Eddie. Not physically tired, but emotionally tired. Tired of old stories, tired of old wounds, and tired of people trying to prove things to the world that no longer mattered at all. About 20 minutes later, the conference room door finally opened. Vanessa emerged first, looking composed. Richard followed closely behind her. One look at his face told me everything I needed to know. The wedding was absolutely not proceeding as planned. All of his confidence was completely gone. The swagger was gone. For the very first time all evening, he looked like a man forced to confront his true self. Vanessa walked gracefully to the front of the ballroom. A staff member handed her a microphone. The room fell into absolute silence. She smiled politely at the crowd, then spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "I appreciate every single person who traveled to celebrate with us." The guests listened carefully, hanging on every word. You could feel the immense tension, the uncertainty, and the anticipation in the air. Then, she continued, "After a long, honest conversation, Richard and I have decided that tonight simply isn't the right time for us to get married." Shocked gasps echoed through the room instantly. Several people exchanged wide-eyed looks. One woman nearly dropped her glass of wine on the carpet, but Vanessa remained completely composed. "We have important conversations we need to have before making a commitment this significant," she explained. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room seemed frozen in time. Then, she smiled kindly at the crowd. "The reception will continue, however," she said with a small laugh. "We've already paid for all the delicious food." That clever comment finally broke the heavy tension in the room. People chuckled. A few people even applauded her honesty. And just like that, the disaster everyone feared transformed into something surprisingly human. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was simply honest. An hour later, the atmosphere had changed completely. Guests relaxed. People returned to eating their dessert. Conversations resumed. The crisis had passed. What remained was deep reflection. I was speaking with several old friends when Richard approached me again. This time, he looked entirely different. Not defeated, just completely exhausted. Like a man who had spent years carrying a false image of himself and suddenly discovered how heavy it had become. "Caroline," he said quietly. I turned to face him. "Yes, Richard, can we take a walk outside?" I considered it for a moment, then nodded my head. We stepped outside into the cool night air. The river reflected hundreds of bright lights from the country club behind us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Richard stopped walking. "I owe you a real apology, Caroline," he said. I looked at him carefully. The old Richard would have blamed circumstances, made excuses, or shifted responsibility onto someone else. This version seemed different. "I should have apologized a very long time ago," he said, his voice cracking slightly. That genuinely surprised me because throughout our 35 years of marriage, Richard rarely showed any vulnerability. "I wasn't fair to you at all," he confessed. I remained completely silent, letting him speak. "I spent years convincing myself I left because I simply wanted more out of life," he said. The words hung heavily between us in the night air. "But that's not the truth, Caroline. I waited. I left because I was deeply insecure," he admitted. That confession seemed to cost him everything. The intense effort showed clearly on his lined face. "I thought external success would fix everything inside me." He laughed bitterly. "It doesn't fix anything." I smiled sadly at him. "No, it doesn't, Richard." Richard looked out toward the dark river. "Tonight was supposed to prove something to you," he whispered. "I know it was. I said. I wanted people to see that I was a success. I know. I wanted you to see it too. There it was. The absolute truth. Simple, ugly, and entirely human. It wasn't a villain's confession. It was just a flawed man admitting what he had spent decades chasing, validation and approval from someone he had deeply hurt. And the irony was truly heartbreaking because he could have simply asked for my forgiveness years ago. Instead, he spent decades trying to manufacture false admiration. I was completely wrong about you, Caroline, he said quietly. I smiled gently. You were wrong about a lot of things, Richard. To my absolute surprise, he let out a genuine laugh. Maybe the first genuine laugh I had heard from him all evening. Fair enough, he said. Before leaving the venue, Vanessa found me and hugged me tightly. Thank you, she whispered. For what, Vanessa? For being honest, she said. I smiled at her. You didn't need me to be strong, Vanessa. She looked over toward Richard. No, but maybe I needed the truth to see clearly. That answer stayed with me for a long time because it applies to all of us, Richard, Vanessa, and even me. Eventually, every single meaningful change in life begins with truth. Not with revenge, not with victory, but with pure truth. And for the first time in 20 long years, all three of us were finally standing firmly in it. The following Monday felt strangely, beautifully ordinary. After everything that had happened at the wedding, I expected some kind of dramatic aftermath. A flood of angry phone calls, wild rumors, embarrassing gossip, or something. Instead, life did exactly what life usually does. It kept moving forward. The sun came up on schedule, people went to work, fresh coffee was poured, meetings were held, patients visited the health clinics, children went to school, and the world continued spinning. At 62 years old, I have learned that is one of life's greatest lessons. No matter how massive a moment feels while you are living through it, most of the world simply carries on. And honestly, that is a beautiful blessing. I arrived at the office early on Tuesday morning. The headquarters of Morgan Healthcare Consulting sat just outside of Charleston. It was a practical, nice building filled with good people doing good work. That has always been more than enough for me. As I walked through the lobby, several employees greeted me warmly, the exact same way they always did. No special treatment, no dramatic conversations, just another productive work day. I truly appreciated that. Success is nice, and respect is meaningful, but normalcy is highly underrated. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my office door. Come in, I called out. The door opened, and Vanessa stepped inside. For a moment, we simply smiled at each other. Neither of us quite knew how to begin the conversation. Finally, she laughed. Well, she said. I laughed right along with her. Indeed. She sat down in the chair across from my desk. You know, this isn't exactly how I imagined last weekend ending, she admitted. Me neither, I said. That was a massive understatement. Neither of us could have ever predicted any of it. The invitation, the tense reception, the confrontation, the postponed wedding, and the uncomfortable truths. Life rarely follows our carefully planned outlines. Vanessa folded her hands in her lap. I wanted to thank you again, Caroline. You already did, Vanessa, I reminded her. I know, she smiled, but I truly mean it from the bottom of my heart. There was absolute sincerity in her voice, the kind that can never be faked. For years, you have taught me to always ask the difficult questions in business, she explained. I listened quietly to her, and this time, I finally had the courage to ask them in my personal life. I nodded my head approvingly. What happens now between you two? I asked. She shrugged her shoulders. Richard and I are talking, she said. That's good. We are being completely honest with each other. That's even better, I replied. She smiled. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure where things go from here. I deeply appreciated that answer. At our age, absolute certainty is highly overrated. Honesty matters far more. You don't have to rush into anything, Vanessa, I said. She exhaled a long breath. That's exactly what I'm learning. After she left my office, I found myself thinking deeply about the younger version of me, the heartbroken woman sitting at a kitchen table 20 years earlier, the woman whose husband had just coldly announced he wanted a divorce. The woman who felt completely abandoned, rejected, and terrified of the future. If I could somehow go back and speak to her on that awful night, what would I say to her? The answer came to me surprisingly quickly. I would tell her this. You are going to be completely okay. Not immediately, not magically, and certainly not without a lot of tears, but eventually, you are going to discover strengths inside yourself that you don't even know you possess right now. You are going to build a beautiful life that belongs entirely to you. And one single day, you will look back and realize that the ending you feared so much was actually just a beautiful new beginning. A week later, Richard unexpectedly called my phone. I almost didn't answer it, not because I was angry, but simply because I wasn't sure there was anything left for us to say. Still, curiosity won out in the end. Hello, I said. There was a brief pause on the line. Then his voice came through. "Hi, Caroline." "Hello, Richard." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke a word. Then he laughed softly. "You know, after 35 years of marriage, it's incredibly strange not knowing how to start a simple conversation with you," he admitted. That made me smile. "That's probably very true, Richard." We ended up talking on the phone for nearly an hour. We didn't talk about the dramatic wedding night. We didn't talk about Vanessa. And we didn't talk about the painful divorce. Instead, we talked about our children, our beautiful grandchildren, our future retirement plans, and old, happy memories. The exact kinds of conversations two older people have when enough time has finally passed to heal the wounds. Something felt completely different about him. It wasn't romantic, and it wasn't overly nostalgic. It was just peaceful. The war between us had ended a very long time ago. We simply hadn't acknowledged it until now. Before hanging up the phone, Richard said something to me that I will never forget. "You know what the absolute worst part of all this is, Caroline?" "What is it, Richard?" I asked. "I spent years trying to prove to you and everyone else that I was doing so much better than you," he confessed. "I stayed perfectly quiet, letting him speak. And all that time, I never once stopped to actually ask whether you were happy, Caroline." His voice softened completely. "I really should have asked you that." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. Not because I was emotional, but because he was absolutely right. That single question would have mattered far more than any petty comparison, more than money, more than status, and more than superficial appearances. Happiness is the one thing people chase their entire lives while foolishly measuring everything else instead. Several months later, Vanessa invited me out to lunch. We met at a small, beautiful restaurant overlooking the harbor, which is one of my absolute favorite places in the city. She looked incredibly relaxed, healthy, and somehow much lighter than before. "How are things going?" I asked her after we sat down. She smiled brightly. "Good, really good. And how is Richard doing?" I asked. "We officially decided not to get married," she said calmly. I nodded my head, not surprised by the news at all. "Are you truly okay with that decision, Vanessa?" "Very okay," she said firmly. There was absolutely no bitterness in her voice, only pure clarity. "We care about each other," she paused, "but sometimes caring about someone isn't always enough to make a marriage work." I understood exactly what she meant by that. Sometimes wisdom arrives disguised as a major disappointment. As for Richard, he eventually moved to a much smaller, manageable home closer to his daughter's family. He started spending much more time with his grandchildren and far less time trying to impress complete strangers with his status. According to our children, he seems much happier now, more grounded, and far more honest with himself. Maybe that is exactly what happens when people finally stop performing for an audience. Maybe that is what true freedom actually looks like in the end. And as for me, I just kept living my beautiful life, working a bit less now, traveling much more, spending precious time with my grandchildren, and deeply enjoying the ordinary moments of each day. Because after everything I went through, I discovered something incredibly important. The absolute greatest revenge in life isn't success. It isn't massive wealth. It isn't proving someone wrong. The greatest revenge is successfully reaching a point in your life where revenge no longer matters to you at all. A point where another person's opinion no longer controls your inner peace, and where your personal happiness belongs entirely to you and only you. That is the exact moment when you are truly free. If you have ever been underestimated by someone, if someone walked away from you when you needed them, or if someone made you feel small, invisible, or unworthy, I want you to always remember this. Your beautiful future is never determined by their narrow opinion of you. Sometimes the people who doubt us the most actually know the least about what we are truly capable of becoming. And sometimes, the most beautiful chapters of our entire lives begin right after someone else thinks the story is completely over.